All right, welcome. Things fell silent in an instant. That was wild. It's wonderful to see you all here. Great to have such a vibrant and healthy crowd this evening. So quick reminder before we get started that live captioning is available today for our virtual and in-person audience. Those joining virtually can enable captions by clicking on closed captioning at the bottom of the live stream window. For in-person audience, live captioning is available through the QR code that you see here. So please visit the AV booth in the back of the room if you need any assistance. So I wanted to share with you several exciting upcoming events at the school. On Tuesday, September 23rd, Lauren and Stephen Stimson will deliver the Sylvester Baxter Lecture, Restraint and Wildness, describing their landscape practice and its mission to connect designers to the land. And then on Thursday, September 25th, the Kenzo Tange visiting critic, Yi-Chun Liu, examines how architectural practice can engage with time through the reuse and reconfiguration of industrial fragments. For more information and to see the lineup of upcoming events, please visit the GSD's website. And now for the main event, Experience Design Futures. So we come together this evening to take stock of experience design, a kind of nebulous and emergent field that's become one of the most ubiquitous and omnivorous forms of design. It's also one of the most comprehensive modes of design, its present incarnation encompassing architecture, graphic design, production design, computation, engineering, curation, and well beyond. So to try and dissect the proper values, tools, methods, anxieties, and possibilities of experience design, tonight we're going to attend to a context where it's practiced, I would argue, particularly thoughtfully in the cultural spaces of exhibitions, museums, and the mutating performing arts. So put simply, the scope and tools and aims of spatial experiences have radically transformed over the last 15 years. New experiential media, such as immersive constructions, soundscapes, smellscapes, tactile interactions, and the expansion of digital systems, woven invisibly or spectacularly, have created an expanded sensorium that collective creatives, like Team Lab, shown here, have leveraged to construct sublime spectacles. Technologies such as AR, VR, immersive multi-channel projection, holographic displays, digital actuation, advanced audio have underwritten entirely new kinds of exhibits within the walls of the museum, but also made those walls more porous. The museum is not only metabolizing media, but is quickly itself becoming a media object. Its skin, a space of display, and its environs, a space of broadcasting in distracted experience, such as the screen on M+ in Hong Kong. So artist Peter Burr's pattern language, for me, kind of captures viscerally the increasingly leaky boundary between digital and physical realities, cultural institutions, and the world beyond. In her catalog of the Whitney Show Dreamlands, curator Chrissy Isles argues that our environment has become an all-surrounding, all-surveilled sensorium in which cyberspace determines the contours of everything, from military strategy to economics to politics, architecture, entertainment, the body, and visual perception. In this new reality, different pluralistic models of visuality have dismantled the fiction of linear perspective, profoundly altering the ways in which space is constructed, controlled, and experienced. And the shift of the image from a two-dimensional plane depicting space to three-dimensional space and beyond has intensified our perception of both, replacing perspectival looking with what she calls a new kind of beholding. These new kinds of beholding, the space of these new kinds of beholding, particularly the ways in which instruments, media, and mutating systems of classification and collecting reformat experience design are particularly interesting to me personally and a part of the work that our office does in this space. So how these play out, crucially in the museum, but well beyond, impact the spaces of encounter between individuals, cultures, institutions, and knowledge systems. New kind of beholding also allow us to behold new things, new entities, new alterities. So experience design can thus become a tangible way to communicate vague and elusive possibilities of futures. In all these recent developments, the legacy of media experimentation of the World's Fairs I find particularly salient and legible. In mid-century World Expos particularly, the format of public encounter with the future was a zone of perpetual media experiment. Eames' office, perhaps among the earliest media designers, I would argue, articulated the first glimmers of some new experiential techniques in their 1964 IBM pavilion. The central experience was an ovoid theater, which through multiple simultaneous data projections created a kind of polyvision that showed how a nascent digital society could experience the world through a constructed media experience. So here, the space of information was a zone of social and cultural interface. It was a prototype in many ways, not only of a specific kind of exhibit, but also of a particular kind of world that we now inhabit. The Eames' work with IBM coincided with the rise of new types of video and media interfaces. On the left, Stan Vanderbeek's movie drone, collage and superimposed panoramic imagery as a vertiginous media ecstasy. And on the right, Ralph Bayer's brown box was a forerunner of video game controllers, but also a kind of harbinger of new modes of media interaction that placed the notion and status of the interface at the center of cultural engagement. And that idea of interface is something to which I think we'll return tacitly or explicitly several times during the conversation. Gene Youngblood's 1970 text Expanded Cinema was a prescient theorization of these epochal developments. But perhaps even more presciently was Buckminster Fuller's foreword to Expanded Cinema. So Buckminster Fuller, I think, is not often given credit for his sort of like media fascinations, but they were in full force in this introduction. So he identified Youngblood's reading of this emergent field as something that could allow the human race to, quote, synchronize its senses and its knowledge in time to ensure the continuance of that little team of humanity now installed by evolution aboard our little space vehicle Earth, close quote. So that is, media might become a unifying interface, not only to abstract culture, but to the societal, our societal needs themselves. So one consequence of this fusion of art, design, and technology has been the proliferation of creative research organizations where artists, designers, and technical experts come together to work commonly on design, art, and technology experiences. So with specialized equipment, infrastructure, and expertise, organizations like SAT, IMPAC, IRCAM, and many others become incubators of this new form of experience design. Another consequence of this sort of art, design, technology fusion is a rich new set of forms of creative expression, circulating through digital art, media art, net art, and many others that are particular to our digital age, each of which demand also particular purpose-built venues for their diffusion. So creators like United Visual Artists, whose work is shown here, exist in that new ecosystem and sort of are a part of this emerging cultural infrastructure for understanding and consuming digital culture. So despite the explosion of new media formats and objects, for many museums, legacy collections sit at the incontrovertible core of their mission. So rethinking them experientially offers fresh ways to understand these collections holistically and intuitively. But these same collections are being digitized at a furious rate, reconstructing collections as data sets. And particularly in the age of AI, the datafication of the museum puts it in a more dynamic but also more slippery space, where the museum becomes part of a larger media machinery of training sets and AI models with, I would say, unknown consequences. But it also opens intriguing new models for participation, community, and collective experience that are irreducibly digital. So Framestore's work for the Tate Modern gives a little bit of a glimpse of the museum as both a data set and experience. It's a sort of interaction to the collection itself, which is equal parts data visualization and cultural interface. And on the back end, the sort of research around the technologies that can enhance, expand, and intensify these kind of sensorial experiences continues apace. So this is one kind of piece of equipment, a sort of wave field synthesis device, which creates continuous soundscape fields, which really kind of like transporting experience. Very much in the incubation phase, but something which we'll be visiting probably in a museum and cultural space near you soon. So new kinds of spaces adapted to the fuller possibility of this experience design are appearing globally. Many are galleries, others are full-blown museums. But with our convergent digital physical reality, we need these kinds of spaces to communicate and engage with these expanded forms of experience design. So at sort of their most developed, these new kinds of institutions engage in curating the cultural relevance of these new convergent threads of design, technology, and art. And they create, I would argue, a kind of like network of a new kind of institution, one which is particular to our time. If we were to think about the Museum of Modern Arts, or the sort of museums of modern art as being characteristic of the first half of the 20th century, Museum of Contemporary Art characteristic of the second half, we might think of museums of the future, museums of tomorrow, museums of future possibilities and alterities as being something which is characteristic of our age, something that turns us forward and expands our notions of what we can imagine through experience design. So cultural and design conversations today concerning multiverses, pluriverses, multiple futures, those are all things which can be explored through this lens of experience design. Our futures are not static, they're not unitary, they're things which are diffuse and full of emergent possibilities. And so now we'll probe some of those possibilities. We'll explore this vortex of media, senses, collections, curations, and ask questions about who the designers of these experiences are, who the curators of them are, and what we have to discover together individually and sort of as a society through the space of experience design. So with that, I'll introduce our distinguished speakers. We first have Jake Barton, who's the founder of Local Projects, an experience design firm that creates groundbreaking museums and public spaces. Credits include landmarks like the 9/11 Memorial Museum, very appropriate for today, the Legacy Museum, Greenwood Rising, Black Wall Street History Center, the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian National or Design Museum, Museum of Language Arts, StoryCorps, Planet Word. Local Projects has won major awards, including the National Design Award and Cannes Lions. And currently, the firm is developing museums for a range of distinguished clients, including the United Nations, Motown, the Courage Museum, and the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. So Barton has designed sets and projections for McNeil, Lincoln Center, and a Lincoln Center play starring Robert Downey Jr. Currently is launching an initiative to develop touring immersive entertainment experiences to catalyze action around the climate crisis. And our second guest is Brendan McGetrick, creative director of the Museum of the Future in Dubai, where he oversees the storytelling and design elements of all content, exhibitions, and visitor experiences. Previously, he was the founding director of Global Grad Show, an annual exhibition of graduate projects from the world's leading design and technology schools. And in 2014, he curated Fair Enough in the Russian Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale. As a writer, designer, and curator, McGetrick's work has appeared in publications in over 40 countries, including the New York Times, Wired, Financial Times, Art Review, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, and Vogue Nippon. So I'm looking forward very much to being in conversation with these two this evening. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Jake.
Amazing. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm Jake Barton, And I'm thrilled to be here. I'm super excited. That was a great presentation from Andrew. I'm really excited to see Brendan's take on this topic as well. I thought it'd be fun to not actually start with the core of my work, but this is a project that was mentioned. This is a show that I designed at Lincoln Center. I designed the sets as well as the projection with Robert Downey Jr. And the reason I wanted to start with theater is it's arguably an art form certainly older than museums, but it kind of speaks to where we are today. It's about an author named McNeil. He's grappling with the impacts of artificial intelligence. The play was both about AI and also built with AI. You can see that's literally a synthetic version of Robert that we built that then turned into Ronald Reagan as well as Barry Goldwater. And then he actually, as a character, turns into his own words in this great visual version of what actually AI is, humans being created out of language. And finally, his character is sort of lost in this sea. He's sort of empty and annihilated in the midst of what technology is doing to us. And the question that I would have is, like, why this arms race in a practice this old of theater? Why are we bringing so many screens and so many pyrotechnics? And the answer, as we all know, is attention, right? It's the currency of our age. This is what we're seeking. This is what the screens are for. This is what the tech is for. This is arguably what architecture has been all the way since back in the day when we've been building larger, better, faster, stronger, more interesting. There's something deep inside humans that are satisfied by that novelty. Now, I'm going to argue, spoiler alert from the beginning, that the real core actually of what we're looking for when we seek this attention is to pay it off with a level of human connection. And that's certainly the core of the work that we've been doing. Most of what we do are museums, and they have been around for centuries. And most of them, when you think of them at their heart, started like this. This is actually the American Museum of Natural History. This is my hometown museum, the Geology Hall, in 1887, where, frankly, audiences were beside the point. You had a collection of artifacts, you had stones that scientists were looking into and were studying, but whether or not it was organized in any way that was interesting was totally not the point of the museum itself, and that's the founding of the museum. That said, within a generation, you have this. This is 1920, when the museum started catering specifically to children to tell them these incredible stories. And this is, even today, what all museums and even larger practitioners beyond museums seek, right? Enraptured children loving on a must-see exhibit. This is a quote from that era that I totally love. If any museum is to prove effective, it must give its knowledge a guise of unusual fascination. Right? This is not a new idea. This is 1913. This is even back farther than Andrew's examples. But at this same institution, AM&H, you see again the arms race. It gets one up from here with what's called the Akeley Hall of African Mammals. If you don't know this, it's a total masterwork in terms of immersive media, these incredible dioramas. He literally invented the genre of dioramas that capture your full visual attention. And at the same time, they were building this. This is another generation later in 1969. Can Man Survive? Has anyone heard of this exhibit? This is also lesser known than the Eames, but I think somewhat of a classic. It was built on the cusp of global warming, ecological decline, and overpopulation. It used immersive projections, clanging, dissonant soundscapes. The curator talked about it as being both inspired and trying to compete with my favorite movie, 2001, by Stanley Kubrick. And it was the first attempt to really rally and really shake visitors and say, pay attention to your behaviors. This is terrible what we're doing to the world. And its effect, as it turns out, not so effective. This is an actual review from the museum. Turns out scolding your visitors is not a success. I'll return to the idea of climate communications at the end. But my story actually intertwines somewhat with this. Within a generation and a half, biodiversity, this is a hall still there today at the heart of the museum. It's an immersive rainforest in Africa. I lived in Africa for 2 months doing collections and then designing. We had immersive projections. We had Pepper's Ghosts. We had scents. We had large soundscapes, etc. So again, giant arms race. What you start with in Akeley, which is within the frame, turns into something you need to walk inside of and feel and touch and smell, etc. Now, when I launched my own firm, Local Projects, we didn't have these types of projects or clients or opportunities, so we sought attention in a very, very different way. This is our first project, StoryCorps, which we did with Dave Isay. And we started with the creation of essentially this highly human experience. You'd go into the booth, you'd interview someone you love, asking them questions. You'd leave with a copy of the oral history, and a copy would go into the Library of Congress. It was essentially participation as a provocation. And because it was so intimate, the tape that ended up on NPR every Friday was so incredibly warm. Here's an example.
See, the thing of it is, I always feel guilty when I say I love you to you, and I say it so often. I say it to remind you that as dumpy as I am, it's coming from me. It's like hearing a beautiful song from a busted old radio. Yeah, well, and it's nice of you to keep the radio around the house.
And so that's one of literally 3 different projects that we've created that we've had marriage proposals inside of. Right? When you build a project that people actually have this incredibly important moment in their life, you're doing something right. We did evolve as a studio in terms of technology, in terms of software. This is a sort of precursor to what Andrew was showing in terms of the museum as a digitized mixtape where you can make your own tour and create your own intelligent activities and understanding the collection from in advance. We build things all around the urban landscape. This is with New York Times, different immersive stories that are embedded inside the 5 boroughs, or this piece that we built for Guggenheim Bilbao is a immersive innovation space that introduces the idea of Bilbao as well as the Frank Gehry building. So I'm going to tell just 5 quick stories about techniques that we use in order to really garner this level of attention. The first one is to make a new world, and I think Brendan is going to do this in spades because his project is incredible. But this is a project called Planet Word that is a museum of words and language in Washington, D.C., just about 10 minutes from the White House. And when you first walk in, this is what you see. It's a little under 1% of the English language, and it's an interactive projection that allows you to talk and to be listened to by the museum itself. We pitched the museum as the world's first voice recognition museum. And the important thing is for us, we use tech as a conceptual idea, right? It's both an interface, but the museum's mission, all the way at the top, is to help visitors find their voice. And we make that concrete by inviting visitors to literally speak and be listened to by the museum itself. You leave here, the next gallery has 31 different languages from around the world, and you have these very human interactions with people telling you about core parts of their language and what it means to them as a culture. Our studio is both hardware and software, so we design things like this, where the sphere actually compresses down into a chandelier. It's a giant kinetic sculpture, essentially a robot, that allows you to clear out the bottom space and use it for rental. But we also make things like this, where you can dip your paintbrush into different words and languages and literally paint this landscape. So they just painted surreal, and you'll see that the plane actually turns into a dragon. So you start to understand vocabulary words in this very synthetic way. Or this space, which we co-designed with the pop star Paul Simon, where visitors both sing their favorite pop songs, and then you learn about why the pop songs are so effective in terms of how the rhythm and the language is set up. So you have both this experience of doing and of learning. And then this is the beating heart of the museum. It's this magical library where every book that you take off the shelf, you can drop down onto these reading tables, and the core of the book literally spills out, and typically the author tells you about why they wrote that book for you. It's the museum as a mixtape. It allows you to engage directly with anything from Jason Reynolds to Mark Haddon to the Diary of Anne Frank or Life of Pi. Or this is literally the first one we ever made, Alice in Wonderland. It was sort of the metaphor for the entire project. Here's the prototype, where you would drop it down and sort of literally fall into the world of the book itself. And we made that idea, that metaphor, so concrete for people as they were making their way through. I'll talk more about prototyping throughout, but it's core to our approach. And it allows us to essentially make these concepts something tangible and to study the behaviors that they elicit from visitors. So the second idea that we wanted to talk about, or I want to talk about, is don't fear the amazing. This is a crazy project we built during the pandemic in Tiananmen Square in China. It's sort of, I would maybe hazard to say, peak globalism, because what you see here is someone wearing what's called the kit, the T-shirt, which has a logo of Chevrolet on it from Manchester United. That year, Chevrolet spent the most money of any sponsor putting their logo on that jersey. Now, if you're in Manchester, if you're in the United Kingdom, if you're a soccer fan, That makes no sense. They do not sell Chevrolets in the United Kingdom. Right? So what's an American company doing spending all this money to advertise with a British soccer team? They were trying to reach the 253 million Manchester United fans in China. We were invited to build essentially an experience center for Manchester United right off Tiananmen Square. This is an interactive locker space. This is a space where you're literally onside the pitch in terms of historic moments. There's a training space where you can inhabit different poses that elicit different sports approaches. Of course, there's bars and there's retails, but this is the core piece of what I want to talk about. It's a technology that we've developed at local projects called the Dream Cube, and it's essentially an immersive game space in a box. It's made really for family entertainment so that you can engage directly with gameplay, and using 8 very high-speed cameras, it tracks the ball in real time. And so you can see, as we're building out different levels and worlds, we actually allow visitors to go through the exact training processes that the players themselves do, and we use the tracking to level up their play, even as it's an entertainment property. So we're very excited about the ways in which we can start to take these interactive, immersive spaces and bring in different interactivity and behaviors so that they're fully synthetic and responsive to the visitors who are inside them. And I'm sure Brendan will talk about this, but it's sort of the holy grail of these immersive spaces. The third project and idea I wanted to talk about was prototyping the future. I know I mentioned this before. This is actually London in the Blitz. If you know, huge quantities of downtown London were completely leveled during World War II. And in fact, one of the few groups that afterwards were a little bit excited about that were archaeologists. Because underneath contemporary London, about 10 or 12 feet, is ancient Londinium. And a lot of the digging revealed this type of thing. This is an ancient Roman mystery cult temple in the heart of downtown, which was later bought by Michael Bloomberg to build the European headquarters for Bloomberg & Co., which he did with Norman Foster. This is the quote that we used to win the pitch to build this next generation archaeology museum. A ruin is a dialogue between an incomplete reality and the imagination of the spectator. And this is the actual visualization of what we said we wanted to do. We wanted to build essentially a 3D hologram that you can walk around inside of and trigger walls of light to recreate the temple itself with all of its rituals, sounds, noises, and all of the actual human experiences that happened inside of it. But in terms of winning the pitch and in terms of actualizing the project, it wasn't until this moment when we built our prototype and actually brought Bloomberg to our actual studio out in the warehouse in Brooklyn to see what this would actually feel like and look like. And so if you go to London today, the way the project works is that the first story, beautifully appointed by Foster & Partners, is this contemporary art gallery, as well as this mammoth case, which shows all of the core finds from this archaeological dig. And then as you make your way downstairs, you actually find out all of the context about this mystery cult. Spoiler alert, it's a mystery cult, so people actually didn't know that much about it, but it's again about the human interactions that happened inside this temple space. And then as you walk into the temple, you have this direct, completely uninterpreted experience of the temple itself. And pacing yourself through these types of experiences becomes really, really critical. The fact that all of the didactic information happens outside, all of the learning, all of the knowledge and context happens outside, means you can come into the temple itself, and as you literally stand on this perch, the walls of light build around you, as does the sound and the rituals, and you can have this moment of just pure experience and presence. And that pacing, I think, is crucial in terms of delivering on these types of immersive experiences. The second to last one I wanted to talk about is particularly prescient for today. This is the 9/11 Museum today on the 24th anniversary. I'm particularly struck in terms of how we built something that both has this immersive quality to it, but that really started not so much with a literal recreation of 9/11, but one that's arguably conceptual. This is actually the original pitch materials we developed to win this project. And what we proposed doing was to mix together facts and remembrances directly adjacent to each other. So you see here a timeline of actual events and times, and then in blue with quotes, these are oral history remembrances of those same events. This is a very concrete technique that we utilized specifically to address the conspiracy theories, the diversity of different challenges to the 9/11 narrative. It's hard to remember, but 9/11 for a moment was a unifying property for our country, arguably the last one that we had 90% approval ratings for our president right after 9/11. But very quickly it devolved into a lot of different points of view. So we use this idea of memories to break open people's openness to points of view that are different than them, to stories that they may not be aware of. And we also ask them to share their own stories inside of the museum itself.
Eye level, eye contact. I can still see this big U on his plane, the tail of his plane, and his plane is bearing down on me. And I dropped the phone, and I screamed, and I dove under the desk.
And that idea kept with us the entire project wide. This is the renderings we made, this is the mock-up and the prototype that we made until now the first thing you see when you walk into the museum is exactly that idea of remembrances and blue text.
On the day of September 11th, 2001.
On September 11th. September 11th.
I was in Honolulu, Hawaii.
Cairo, Egypt. Des Champs-Élysées à Paris.
In college at UC Berkeley.
I was in Times Square.
São Paulo do Brasil.
Estava in Miami, Florida.
Scottish Highlands.
We were actually in a meeting when someone barged in and said,
"Oh my God, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center."
and I frantically get to a radio.
When I heard it over the radio.
And you having then heard people witness it, you witness it yourself through a huge deluge of different artifacts and experiences, and again, remembrances from people from around the world. And then at the end, you're invited to actually share your own thoughts, your own experiences and memories. These I literally took with my own phone. My father came home from work that day in a dusty suit. I thank God he came home at all. I miss you both every day. Love you, Dad and Chris. Or we were mere kids when this happened, and now as adults we understand the impact of this tragic event. And you see again how people's remembrances and the ability to invite them for their own human voice to share lives in a very, very meaningful way inside of this much larger story. So you go from these very big, epic, even immersive ideas down to just the human voice and the human memory. And a lot of people cite this as well as the oral history chambers as by far and away the most powerful parts of the museum. Last project and the last idea is this idea of telling the truth. This is Greenwood Rising, a museum that we made around the Tulsa Race Massacre, actually, coincidentally, the worst form of atrocity in America before 9/11 itself. In this case, what we did was meter a range of different experiences that moved from didactic to immersive and back. And so when you walk in, we literally build Greenwood around you using projection mapping and different exhibits, and then you walk into a barbershop and hear Barbers of the Day.
You are living in it now, Jerome. This is our promised land. We could buy us a seat at the table. That's what you did. Won't be long now. People are just people.
But left unchecked, those people could be a dangerous mob.
Let the church say amen.
And so if you're the kind of person who wants to sit in this immersive, recreated barbershop, super fun way to get a lot of the same information and stories about Greenwood from back in the day, and it offers you these types of examples. This is literally the granddaughter of that barber who we're recreating there, who's sitting and visiting, and it gives you these types of magical moments where you're inside of history and the present, which is a lot of the points of this experience. But then we go into this type of didactic experience, the arc of oppression, which really unlocks what the history really of oppression in this country is going all the way back to its founding on social, economic, and political terms. And spoiler alert, we're going to get a little bit into some of the material around the Greenwood Rising event itself.
He was begging, please, don't set my house on fire. Please, don't set my house on fire. Of course, that is exactly what they did.
And so having gone through the past, you find yourself in the present. The same type of topics, political, economic, and social, the same constructs around redlining, voter suppression, mass incarceration, issues of the day are inviting you to come and have a conversation about them. But again, we end with the human gesture. You're invited to commit yourself in terms of how you're going to take action towards racial reconciliation, and that is literally the culmination of the entire museum experience. And just one last point that I started raising, particularly around climate, because you've seen, I've been able and had the great honor to work on so many projects and so many topics. I really thought that in my youth that when we'd start seeing events like this on a regular basis, people would really start taking action, particularly in terms of museums. When you ask people, I think on average, what do you think about museums and climate? This is actually what you end up getting. And it's awful that this is basically what that medium can deliver from an activist standpoint or from a persuasion standpoint. I like to think about certainly what fashion is able to do. This is Stella McCartney being able to bring a level of allure to the idea of sustainability. I myself, like I said, have been working on different immersive properties around the climate itself. And anyone who wants to talk about that or has ideas about that, I'm super interested. In this case, basically, as the temperature drops, you can literally see the world getting better through your action. So trying to make a very concrete metaphor. And we could talk about how this works and how it doesn't work. But lastly, I wanted to end with this last question that I raised at the beginning about Robert Downey Jr., this artist who's sort of tortured by AI, since we were talking about technology so much. In the final scene, we have a single actor who reads a sonnet. And so after all the digital pyrotechnics, it's really the human connection that will always capture our attention. We can grab attention anyways, but if we're not paying it off with emotion, with meaning and humanity, we're not actually taking advantage of all of the tools at our disposal. And with that, I will say thank you so much.
Okay, hi everyone, and thank you, Jake. That was really excellent. Okay, so hi, I'm Brendan. I am creative director of the Museum of the Future. I don't have a lot of time to talk about everything to do with the museum, so I'm just going to play a video that kind of shows some of the elements of it. Yeah, this is our modest, understated building. So basically, the building's been open since 2022. The premise is it was created by the government of Dubai, and the idea was that it's a kind of dedicated space for transporting people to potential futures, possible futures, and kind of creating almost like a social machine for getting people interested in the future, and on the other hand, feeling that their contribution matters. So what we try to do in the museum is create environments that are interactive, that are responsive, that feel incomplete without the actions and contributions of the visitors. And those environments kind of are all within a single timeline, the year 2071. The themes are different and the kind of places that you visit are different, but you're in a kind of single future that is bound together by sort of similar properties, problems that are recognizable and kind of have developed from the present. And then you, again, are kind of asked to explore and inhabit these futures. And the kind of highest level message is really that a better future is possible, but not without your help. And that's sort of coming directly from the government itself wanting to create a place dedicated to trying to produce that feeling in its own people and then ultimately of the people of the world. So that's kind of the highest level mission of the museum. And I'll just talk a little bit about sort of how we interpret that challenge and how we've tried to create an experience that feels worthy of that level of ambition. So one of the challenges is, how do you make a museum of the future? A lot of people sort of ask if we find the name Museum of the Future challenging because museums are traditionally associated with the past. We actually don't. That isn't the challenge that we that we thought was difficult. Our challenge was, what do you do about the future? So I think it's important to talk about the context in which sort of we made the Museum of the Future. We're sort of in a golden age of dystopian fiction. These are examples of, television and film, Hunger Games, Black Mirror. The list goes on and on. There's a analog in literature too, analog in video games too. The kind of apotheosis of all this is The Last of Us, which is a AAA blockbuster video game, dystopian video game, which then became a blockbuster dystopian television show. So we're sort of in this never-ending, seemingly inescapable echo chamber of negative visions of the future. So we describe that as the crisis of the imagination. Obviously, when you think about the future, there are many crises that come to mind: climate crisis, demographic crisis, obviously military, economic, etc. They sort of, new ones emerge seemingly every day. But the crisis that we wanted to embrace, and we felt that the museum's kind of existential mission was to kind of try to engage and hopefully meaningfully contribute to what we describe as the crisis of imagination. So in order to do that, we had to first think, what kind of future are we actually talking about? What future are we trying to present? And then ultimately, what future do we hope that people would want to work toward? So I'll just kind of quickly explain these. We made this kind of manifesto at the very, very, very beginning of the work, before we started designing anything, and it was purely to kind of help provide a framework for the kind of work and the kind of visions and the kind of future world that we wanted to provide for people. So these are the sort of guiding principles. The first, the Museum of the Future seeks participants and not visitors. Obviously, interactivity and a feeling of meaningful connection is essential to the kind of thing that we're trying to do. We're not forecasters, we're dreamers. We wanted to make it very clear that the museum wasn't a place where you go and you learn, what stock to invest in or what subject your children should study in school. It's a place for vision. It's a future built on timeless, universal human experience. We wanted to make sure that this was not a technology-dependent vision of the future. It was a vision of the future which assumed that ultimately we as people are not going to change fundamentally. Our environment changes, the circumstances in which we exist change, but there are things which bind us and bind us to our ancestors and to our descendants that we wanted to kind of, we wanted to base the experience in. A future grounded in Dubai's values. This is a really important one. The museum is an initiative of Dubai, but I would say even more importantly, when we talk about the future, and particularly when we talk about the crisis of imagination related to the future, it's vitally important that new voices are added to the conversation about the future. What the future looks like, how people imagine the future to be, has been so dominated by the West and to some extent Japan for so long that I would say many of these visions have become sort of exhausted and no longer relevant. Obviously, that's changing now with new voices added to the mix, and we wanted to make sure that our voice felt very much grounded in the place that it originates in. Next, a future in which technology provides people with new abilities without replacing existing ones. This is really obviously about all the concerns that people have about the way in which technology will be imposed upon you, when the reality is that in a perfect world, technology is expanding what we can do, not limiting it. A future in which you'd want to live even if you didn't know who you would be. This really speaks to inequality. A future in which you don't have to be super rich in order to survive, basically, which I think we all are concerned we might not be going to experience. A future focused on renewal rather than growth. This obviously speaks to climate issues and ways to apply our imagination toward that. A future based on fact. We knew that we were going to be doing, big flights of fancy and very aggressive visions of what is possible, but we wanted to make sure it was always grounded in things which are factual, scientific, and possible. A future in which science and spirituality support each other. This is kind of an extension of Dubai's values. One of the things that I think is really important about, particularly actually Jake and I were just talking about it, related to climate, is finding a way to sort of reunite religion and science, because they're the two kind of major human enterprises dedicated to the future, or dedicated to sort of an endless vision of human existence. And they have worked in tandem and worked in very, very fruitful partnership at times in the past, and we really look forward to a future in which that's possible. Finally, a future that is fundamentally optimistic but honest about the dangers of the present. So really for us, this was our response to things like Black Mirror, which are, of course are absolutely brilliant. And we're all fans of Black Mirror, I mean we being the team, but for us it's a very easy thing to do. It's very easy to look at the present, pick out a dysfunctional thing, and then extrapolate it into a future where it's defined by that dysfunction. What we wanted to do is say, okay, let's look at that as functional thing, and how could we intervene, and with the right values and with the right investment, with the right commitment, turn it into an extraordinary future that you would actually want. So that was the sort of ideological or philosophical manifesto of what future we wanted. Then we made another manifesto which was about what kind of experience do we want to provide, and that's this. Okay, and so it was very important for us to do this both kind of for ourselves and for our stakeholders, but also to kind of destabilize the perception of what a museum of the future should be or should look like. This, when I joined the project, is what the expectation of what the museum would be, or the architect's interpretation of what a museum of the future looks like. So it was very important to make a strong statement against that. Then the next step is you obviously build a team of geniuses to help bring this kind of vision into reality. So these are some of our collaborators. There are many more. It's not an easy thing. In a lot of ways, this, I would say, is a very realistic depiction of what the experience is like. Everybody has their own personality, their own signature, their own ego, their own kind of desire to do the best thing imaginable. And so you have to coalesce around a single vision, a single interpretation, a single experience that feels generous and feels cohesive. And this is kind of a joke, obviously, but it's not that much of a joke because, like, this is what our Zoom calls look like. And adding to the complexity of, you know, all these different individuals, you also have all these different cultures represented in the project. So again, in a certain sense, a absolutely perfect expression of Dubai and what makes Dubai such an extraordinary place. Also, a very challenging project to do. So one of the ways in which we responded to that, one of the ways in which we tried to create kind of consistency and a sort of shared kind of universal language was to look at the kind of unique properties of a museum of the future. So obviously a traditional museum has a permanent collection. As a museum of the future, we would never have that. So instead we said, okay, let's not have a permanent collection, let's have permanent questions. Let's have questions that we ask every single kind of work that we do to sort of stress test it and make sure that it's kind of responding to the issues that we consider essential. So these were our permanent questions. Where is the love in this piece? Where is its sense of awesomeness and revelation? How does it draw the audience in? How does it make them feel needed? Where is this work's sense of humor? Where is the past? So every piece in the museum had to respond to these questions, and I will say that the designers had to kind of like, it's nice to be in a school, because like students, they had to write these very kind of uptight responses to these questions. But actually, for me at least, I thought it was a really, really useful activity because it forced a kind of rigor on some pieces that otherwise could have been, you know, more visually driven, more purely experientially driven. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just show a single floor from the museum. I wish I could show more, but I think the floor that I'm going to show is really representative of a lot of the things that I've tried to introduce here. We have other floors. We have a floor which is about space, a floor which is about wellness and the senses, but the middle section is what I'm going to talk about. So this is called the Heal Institute. So the idea is, again, we're in the year 2071, and this is a sort of speculative scientific institution. So it's about ecology, and of course, if we're in the year 2071 and we're honest about climate change, very significant things have happened by the year 2071. So we're assuming already in this narrative, ecosystem collapse, mass extinction, and everything that our best qualified people warn us about. So again, this is kind of my point about being honest about what we're facing, and then realizing that there are certain things maybe that we should not assume that we're going to change, but then how do we respond to the consequences of that lack of change? So basically, this institute exists to apply synthetic biology and artificial intelligence to begin repairing damage we've done to the natural world. I'll explain this in more detail, but one of the things that we're trying to do in the museum is show how emerging technologies like synthetic biology and AI, which are scary in many ways, very, very undefined in terms of what their ultimate legacy and effect will be, could potentially be channeled towards something positive. And so that's really what, in a way, this whole experience is about. So it begins with something called the forest. This is basically an immersive multisensory experience. It's a 3D recreation of the rainforest. So in order to make it, the studio that made it, Marshmallow Laser Feast, traveled to the Amazon, and I'll show a quick video about the process, but I just want to explain what it's trying to do in our future. In our future, what it's imagining is that we can create 3D models of the natural world to help us begin to recreate the natural world. And at the time that we were developing it, the fire in Notre Dame had happened, and there was a lot of kind of conversation about the fact that you could rebuild it more easily because they had these very high fidelity 3D models of the building. So we thought, okay, if you can do that with a building, what if we could do that with the natural world? What if we created incredibly detailed 3D models of a healthy, functional ecosystem, and then begin to try to repair it when that ecosystem collapses? So that's basically what this piece is doing. So basically this talks a little bit about the process. The designers went, they mapped the space, they used photogrammetry to capture this tree, they made scent samples, sound samples, and tried to create as much as possible a kind of digital twin of a small part of the Amazon. And then again, the idea would be, in this future, that digital twin allows us to begin trying to repair and to some extent, kind of resurrect ecosystems that have collapsed. Okay, I'm going to keep going because we don't have that much time. So then, yeah, this is the experience. There's it's a sort of interactive experience on the one hand. There's really, really beautiful spatial audio that's created out of a kind of collage of hundreds of different field recordings that try to produce as close as possible the feeling of being in that small part of the Amazon. I could nerd out on how we achieved this for a really long time. I will not do that, but I would just say this is really speaks to the kind of value of the immersive experience, or the value of the exhibition experience, and the kind of location-based experience versus something which is, experience on your TV or on your computer. The way that you're able to manipulate sound. And another thing that we're able to do is incorporate scent. So we made a kind of bespoke scent, which is created in order to, on the one hand, give you the feeling that you're in the Amazon, on the other hand, destabilize that feeling by giving it a sort of artificial quality too, because you're not in the Amazon, you're in a 3D model of the Amazon. So the notion of this first part of the experience is that you learn about all of the challenges that the Amazon is now facing. Then the kind of heart and soul of this floor is called the library. It's here, this very large space. And the idea is that you've been challenged as a visitor and as a citizen scientist to try to create a new species that can exist and thrive within this changed ecosystem. So what you do is you basically navigate around this library of different species, collecting DNA and kind of creating the raw material for a synthetic being. I'll just explain one example of it. So there's basically 2,400 of these unique cylinders. Each one is dedicated to a different species, and with the device that we created, you can download its DNA, this device. So this creates this kind of place where you can navigate and explore and at the same time do something functional. So what's really beautiful about this is that you really realize that if you're talking about synthetic biology, there's no hierarchy of value in the species. It's really just what properties does a species have, and is it useful for what you're trying to make? So I think that's beautiful because there are so many kind of charismatic species that everyone's worried about, but at the same time, there are very simple organisms that actually also have incredibly valuable properties. So then I think I'm missing a slide. That's lame, but okay. I'll just quickly explain one thing. So basically, you navigate this space. You navigate this space, and you're given a kind of mission, and the device you have allows you to choose different species in order to synthesize a new species. So, for example, a fire-resistant tree. I'll talk about that in the next section, but I thought I was talking about it here. Anyway, another thing that we did, which is kind of interesting, is we really use this space almost as a medium in itself. So in addition to being able to navigate it and do things with it, you can intervene in it with an app that we created so that basically here, if you want to, you can actually temporarily reveal only the extinct species that are kind of remaining. So yeah, you have the power as a visitor to kind of fundamentally change the space, which we find that people find extremely exciting. And the idea here is that what you're revealing are species which are currently alive, but in our 2071 timeline have become extinct. Okay, so then the idea here is that with the samples you've collected in this library, you go to the next space, which is called the lab, and you synthesize them into a test species, and then you run tests on whether or not it will have a positive effect on the ecosystem within a digital space. So we have these stations here, and then, for example, the fire-resistant tree that I mentioned before, the idea is that you would have synthesized it by collecting a host species which is native to the Amazon, crossing it with another kind of tree with thicker bark that's better able to respond to fires, and then you kind of introduce it, oh yeah, like this basically. This should have come earlier, but anyway, so this is kind of how it works, and you collect these different species through the library that I showed previously. Okay, then the idea is you bring your synthesized species into this ecosystem simulator, you run a test, and you see if it has a positive effect on the ecosystem. So you see it grow, you see if other plants thrive around it, and if not, you get a message saying, thank you for trying, we learn from failed experiments too, but this actually isn't going to have a positive effect. Because of course we're very sensitive to the fact that you can't play around with synthetic biology, especially when you're introducing into the natural world, so that's why we're suggesting you have a 3D digital simulation where you can test it. And then, yeah, so we have different kind of tests like this. This is you kind of seeing if the fire-resistant tree works. Okay, finally, the final space. So then the idea is that, oh, I'm over. The idea is that the species that have been tested in this way and have been kind of succeeded are then incubated in this space, which is called the observatory. And this space was created by Andrew and his wonderful team at Certain Measures. And because I'm over, he's not going to stop me because this is his work. Okay, so what is happening here is that there's a nursery with all these different speculative species that have been developed. They're being monitored, they're being incubated, and you're able to see in certain places where they're being deployed out in the world. And this is a really, really beautiful work that I don't have enough time to talk about. But what you're seeing here is, on the one hand, you're closing the loop of what this institute does. So it basically encourages the public to understand what's happening in the natural world through this 3D model. It allows them to collect DNA samples and synthesize a kind of purpose-designed species which could survive in this changed climate. It then allows you to test whether it would have a positive impact. And then finally, those ones that do have a positive effect, it allows you to see that they're already being brought out and introduced into the world, and then their influence is being constantly monitored and tested to see whether they're helping improve conditions out in the field. Okay, so finally, I'll just show this piece. Andrew showed it very briefly. This is called the vivarium. So this kind of, in a way, is the epitome of everything in this space and kind of in this floor. It's a sort of climate-controlled mini ecosystem where purpose-designed species have been created to, again, survive changes in climate, harsh climatic conditions, and provide a vision of a future that, in a way, is not exactly reassuring, but at the same time is totally committed to active engagement and optimistic belief in human possibility. Thank you.
That was fabulous, gentlemen. A lot of fun, and I think raised a lot of interesting questions, particularly around aspects of narration, aspects of sort of the human connection of experience, the fact that experience is really a kind of it's a medium to inspire a certain sense of awe, and it's a medium to sort of like gain attention, but it's also ultimately a bridge towards that human connection. And so I wanted to begin with some questions around narration, and I think particularly, Jake, in your work, there were a number of moments where very personal narrations became a real kind of like crux of the entire experience. And I was curious from both of you, and at the same time, I think one of the things that's so fascinating about the Museum of the Future is that there is a kind of like meta-narration that's happening, a very kind of specific, or an implied narration of your movement through the museum itself, but also a kind of story about what kind of world we might inhabit. And so that power of stories, the relationship between stories and experience, I think is something that was very evident in both of your presentations. And I was curious. There were some moments, Jake, where it felt like the very personal stories that were offered by visitors, for example, really, transported the experience to a different place. And I was curious what you see as the sort of possibilities for designers to sort of create that kind of like a more emotionally engaging experience versus what the participants themselves are providing. I mean, where do you draw where do you think about facilitation of that kind of that sort of storytelling as being more impactful than what we can do as designers, I guess?
I mean, I think that it's a great question, first of all. I think first and foremost, and you also see this in Brendan's work, there's this question of grabbing people's attention and then also what you're going to do with it. Right? And you actually have to consider both, and you need both in order to be successful today. There's definitely no world in which if you build it, they will come. Like, you actually have to proactively think about how to capture people's attention in order to just be seen, i.e. to be relevant. So that's the first thing. That's the sort of tough news. That said, I think just relying on media pyrotechnics or novelty alone has also been exhausted as a strategy. Right? So you have to figure out how to actually make an authentic, meaningful statement, connection, opportunity, dialogue. There's lots of different ways to do it. But that's why, certainly in the course of our work, but when I talk in a sort of third person about our work, I'm always quick to say, like, these interfaces look amazing. They're great. People put them on Instagram. People talk about them on Wired, et cetera. But without the meaningful aspect of them, not only does it feel hollow as the person authoring it, it feels hollow from the audience's standpoint, right? And it very, very quickly just brings out their appetite for some other interface or some other move that's going to draw them forward. That's where the sort of authenticity or the story or the meaning or emotion really needs to come in. And many people have one or the other, but it's putting them together that will make you successful today.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of sort of experience as a way to construct meaning I think it's a very powerful and kind of like very motivated way to understand it. And I think it was interesting to sort of like take a little bit of a walk down memory lane in terms of kind of like museums' values, because I think there is a way in which some of those values are intended to be sort of like, obviously communicated and embedded in the experience. I was curious, Brendan, from your perspective, now, the museum it's been around for several years. There's a way in which people have encountered the museum in a whole range of ways. And I'm curious about the stories that people tell you and themselves about the museum. Like, how have they encountered it? How do they sort of like apprehend it? How do they understand the meaning of the museum in their own experience? What's the sort of like, post-occupancy survey of people from the Museum of the Future?
Well, I mean, they interpret and understand it in the widest range possible, including total lack of understanding. Like, that's and I think that's a kind of maybe an important thing to say, that the museum is a particularly challenging place, a particularly exciting place, but a particularly challenging place because we have audiences from everywhere. We've had 180 different nationalities visit, and they're coming with very, very different expectations, very, very different experiences. Many of them don't speak English or Arabic, which are the two languages of the museum. So it's very hard to tell a story or provide complex sort of provocations for people. So to me, like the way I've kind of made peace with it is really like that interpretation is owned by everyone. And I can tell you nice stories of people saying like, I'll tell you one nice story. This isn't even about, this isn't even about it actually, but someone said to me once, I went to the museum with my girlfriend, and when we left, we were more in love than when we went in.
I thought you were going to say that they proposed, and then you have at least one.
However, I've also spent some of the bleakest nights of my life reading the one-star reviews on Google, and those are absolutely grim. So, you know, I think you just have to try the best, and the kind of values that I was showing, the reason why we did that is just so that we knew that there was a sort of constant sort of positivity within it. Even if people missed the whole thing, we knew what they wouldn't see, which is sort of like kill or be killed, you know, arms race of, you know, techno overlords.
No Terminator robots around.
Yeah, which kind of a lot of people I think want to see, frankly, when they come to a museum of the future. Some people do. So we just wanted to make sure that there was a certain kind of feeling about the future that we provided. And then everything else, you hope people understand it. You try everything you can do to offer as many entry points as possible, but you can't assume anything, really.
One of the things that I found really exciting about bringing the two of you together is that we can have the perspective, the kind of like institutional sort of curatorial perspective on the one hand and maybe the designer's perspective on the other. But as we've talked, it turns out that I think, especially in experience design, those perspectives often blur and overlap and intersect in a whole range of different ways. And I was curious how each of you kind of saw kind of the most constructive way for one to work with the other in terms of thinking through these experiences. Because experience is a very visceral thing, and I think everybody has a very particular perspective on what will be a successful experience. And so, you know, obviously like conflicts and debates can occur, but I'm curious your experience or perspective on what a kind of symbiotic or kind of the most powerful version of that kind of partnership can be between designer and curator.
I mean, I think that there's, and I think the Museum of the Future is such an interesting example of this. There's a real evolution that's happening now. I won't say a revolution because I do think it's both evolving and even within the museum it's changing. There's a difference between, and this is what we say in our own studio, or certainly how I define an experience designer, right? When you're like, oh, experience designer, you're being very generous by saying it's like a porous or evolving. It's just a giant grab bag container, right? I mean, let's be honest. You can go back to all of these different examples.
Trying to make our discussion somewhat legitimate here, but yeah.
No, but the point is, from a pedagogical standpoint, it's ludicrous, and the reason that it is because
tell the students that.
No. I'm saying that on purpose because I think that first and foremost, as opposed to a discipline like architecture, like medicine, that has a deep wellspring of licensing and legality around and parameters around the practitioner of that domain, experience design has become this grab bag. It has some overtones of technology, but not always. People have tried to define it in different ways, but they end up with like a checklist of 31 options. In our studio, the way that we think about it, because we're essentially exhibit designers mixed with software engineers. We don't do outside architects, but we have lots of licensed architects who work with us. What I say is, you can make an exhibit about stuff. Here is my case. I'm telling you this case has things inside of it. I'm saying with my third-person voice, look at these objects. I'm talking to you as a curator, right? Or, like in the Museum of the Future, you walk in. There's no label. You're like, what is this place? Your own curiosity brings you into the experience, and you have to actually unpack and experience what this is and understand it for yourself. In its simplest form, one makes an exhibit about something, and one makes an exhibit that is something, right? That's like a profound semantic way to define the fact that we try and make things that are the actual things itself. You want to make a museum of language. What would you say were their words? We have a giant word wall. It's like not tough to figure out, right? And there's ways in which we organize it that's interesting. We tell stories, et cetera, et cetera. We use voice as a medium, but also we make people think about their own voice. So there's a level of sort of pronounced authenticity when you build things that are like that people can feel. And that's why I think when you read these statements in 9/11, you've seen big, epic, literally world-changing exhibits, and like this little message that another human being wrote in exactly the same physical space touches you in a very different, authentic way, because it's just so personal, and it is this moment of very direct communication. So I think, and we were just talking about this, I think we've sort of hit the limit of where uninterpreted, I walk in and wander around and try and figure things out, types of spaces have sort of reached their limitation, right? There's only so far that you can go expecting the audience to be able to piece together your magical mystery and get something out of it. Now, there are classic examples of experience design. Sleep No More is a good one, and there's lots of others that are that sort of like mystery, lots of blind men feeling around versions of an elephant type of an experience that don't have a narrative point to be made. But, there's a reason why film and cinema did the same thing in the 70s. They went really, really abstract, and at a certain point it was exhausted, and they went back to actual stories, right? And I think museums have sort of made that U-turn, and immersive experience made that U-turn to be like, it's okay, you can just tell people, we're going to tell you this story. It's going to be about the future, or it's going to be about climate. Within that, there will be experiential aspects. We will embody you inside of it. But we don't need to pretend there isn't a frame around it. We can make an experience. We can construct it. We can tell you we're constructing it and why we're constructing it. And then you can go experience it. And arguably, it's more powerful when you give people a chance to step outside it and reflect upon it. And I'd be interested in hearing Brendan's thoughts on it, but the fact that your museum beautifully goes from one sort of like drop people into this synthetic narrative gallery at a time, is there a way in which having then a sort of looking moment back on it, like what did we learn here, and actually asking people to be self-reflective, is that something that you miss or that you think would be more effective?
I would say currently we miss it. I think that we do a lot of inspiring and a lot of challenging and hopefully a lot of entertaining. But what that actually means for people isn't actually part of the experience. It's part of conversations people are having and all that, but it's not. There isn't that kind of. And also, we need you to offer your thoughts here. This is something which I would say is a weakness of the museum. The only thing I'll add to it is just in relation to like what experience design is. The reason I took the job at the museum is the person who was really running it and kind of was part of the initial team conceiving it is a guy called Noah Rafford. And he said to me, basically, he was like describing the museum in the abstract, and he was going, basically, we're looking for someone who has the rigor of a museum curator, but a theme park background. And I was like...
That was you.
And I had been doing shows like at the V&A and at the Design Museum, and I knew that actually that was right. That they were all trying to figure out a way to have theme park type experiences. Maybe not theme park, but you know what I mean. They were trying to bring in spectacle and bring in experience in a way that, collection-based exhibitions are very, challenging to do. So anyways, I did think at the time, like, oh, right, that is the museum of the future. Like, it is somehow bridging those two things. I am not that guy, and I think we haven't necessarily done that. But I do think that was a really interesting way of articulating kind of the moment that we're in right now.
It's very funny because when I was doing a little bit of research in preparation for the panel, I ran across, so I mentioned Gene Youngblood and sort of expanded cinema, and there was this whole sort of kind of discourse about expanded art that was around in those early 70s. And there was a really amazing kind of like map that someone associated with Fluxus actually produced of all of the different branches of expanded art, and expanded cinema was one of those. There's a kind of genealogy to it, and one of the sort of trajectories of genealogy is electronics. One is sort of, mini channel projection. One of them is fiction. One of them is Walt Disney World. And so there's a way in which, I don't know, maybe there's sort of like threads of that. I mean, Disneyland is an amazing place to have. All of your attention is there. So there's some aspect in which maybe that's not so there's maybe a kernel of truth there. So.
But I've seen exactly that map today. Like, people keep trying to say, like, this is why I was sort of poking holes in the idea of an experience designer. They're like trying to define it by its parts or by examples of it. Another good definition that I've heard, and this may be more resonant in terms of your student work, or even as practitioners, if you're an architect, if you are a graphic designer, there's, again, this incredible lineage. There's archive, and there are specific moves that those disciplines afford you, right? And you can think of it akin to a violinist. Like, there's the violin, there's a whole canon, and you put the two together, and then you can make your way up and be a supreme violinist. If you're an experience designer, or arguably working in this sort of hybrid mentality, you first conceive of and then build the violin, and then you learn how to play it, right? And those are very, very two different approaches. I think it's porous today because lots of architects think of the medium of architecture as anything that could include scent or motion or cinema or et cetera, right? So the boundaries of these disciplines have become so porous. But I would say in general, you know, lots and lots of cultures, literally for millennia, have defined these different columns rigorously in terms of disciplines. It's the people who synthesize them together in novel, unconventional ways with new purposes, building a sort of sensory, narrative, or experiential machine, and then learning how to play it to effect. Those are the people that I would call experience designers.
You know, it's interesting, though. I mean, you know, Elizabeth Christopheretti, my colleague, and I have had a lot of conversations about transdisciplinarity and what transdisciplinary means and is. And one of the most compelling ways that I think we've been able to think about it is that transdisciplinarity is not, it's not a destination, it's a transition state, basically, between previous disciplines and new disciplines. And so experience design itself is maybe not a discipline, but actually a cluster of disciplines, each with their own specific sort of like chosen lineage, with their own sort of like preferred tools, and with their own kind of like nascent practices. And so I think that's actually, when you look at the landscape of experience design, there's a little bit of that kind of quality. You see these sort of like subclusters and islands and affinities and sort of sort of friend groups or something, like cliques in a way, dealing with some of the, or that have that kind of coherence. And so I think we're in a moment where in 15 years, maybe there won't be experience design per se, but there'll be 5 different kinds of experience design which are more coherent and somehow more disciplined.
But I also think maybe being an experience designer is being someone who really understands the unique properties of each of those disciplines and how they can be applied to maximum effect. Because I think every discipline has its own strengths and weaknesses. And really, especially when you're combining them, you're wanting to make the most out of what one can do well and not ask it to do anything that it can't do well, because other things can do that well. And so it's really combining them all in a way that really honors them and doesn't overload them. I think is really sort of the challenge of a transdisciplinary practice or an experience designer.
Yeah, and I think it's true. I find this actually in the most capable sort of like transdisciplinary sort of like workers of any type, is that they're expert code switchers, and they have some sort of like deep expertise in a range of different things, and then by combining those together, they're sort of creating something that's synthetic and sort of very special and sometimes very idiosyncratic in particular, but ultimately sort of points the way to some new kind of like nascent discipline. I want to ask one more question, and then maybe, we don't have, actually, maybe we should, okay, yeah, I'm getting the signal that we should open it up for questions. So I'd love to hear some questions from the audience. I don't know, we have some mic runners, so.
Well, thank you all for coming here. This is super insightful, but I do have a question for all 3 of you. How do you design for the unexpected or unintended user interactions while maintaining the story or narrative outcome you want?
What happens when someone goes off the rails?
I think that question is exactly why we put prototyping at the heart of our work, because ultimately, and speaking of sort of a third way to think about defining an experience designer is designing behaviors, right? That's the ultimate outcome. Your deliverables might be a physical interface or an environment or a narrative or a museum exhibition, but ultimately you want people to do things, learn things, and feel in a very particular way. So if that's your goal, you're building tool sets, you're building interfaces, and then you need to literally watch as people are using it. First, you need to determine for yourself if your approach plausibly holds water. You conceptualize it, you prototype it quickly, you start looking at people using it, and if it doesn't work, then you pivot, or better yet, you look at what is working and amplify that during both the development. It gets very tricky when you're building things like Museum of the Future, or many of our projects which have big physical hardware AV systems attached to it, because you have a tiny window to essentially test, commission, and then launch it. So that becomes a practitioner challenge. But in general, it's not a matter of sort of forcing people into the interactions you want. It's a matter of sort of provoking them and seeing what's delightful and interesting, learning from it, and then amplifying those things.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I also think what we're trying to do, we're basically reimagining or redesigning the exhibitions at the moment. And one thing that we're trying to do is build in for kind of responding to what you say, misuse, especially kind of misuse that's more interesting than our original intent, because this happens too. So how do you kind of, in the analogy that I always like sort of think about is like a theater, like a playwright. A playwright will sit in the audience, watch the play, and go like, wow, that line isn't hitting right, and rewrite the play, you know? And I think that as experience designers and as people doing things with the public, we need to have a little bit more of that attitude. Like, okay, we wanted it to be like this, but actually people aren't responding like that. And maybe the way they are responding to it is interesting too. And I'll give just one really small example. We had this kind of one moment on a different floor where you're supposed to kind of make a wish to the future. Actually, no, you're not. You were supposed to offer this kind of token that we gave you, not make a wish to the future. But then what we found is that people were standing there and almost treating this like little slot where you offer this token like a kind of shrine. And they were really spending time there, having a meaningful connection with it. So we were, of course, like, oh, fantastic. This is 100 times cooler than what we were thinking of. So then we changed it a bit and gave it a bit more kind of authenticity or legitimacy as a shrine or as a place to offer a wish to the future. And I think it's tough for all the reasons that Jake was saying. It's not a super flexible medium. It's hard to make changes, but I think we should design in a kind of period of audience feedback where we can make those changes. We have budget for them, and we have a bit of flexibility to do them, because I think ultimately it improves the work, and it also kind of takes pressure off of like misuse. I don't know, like that reads as a failure, but I think a lot of times it's just like, well, let's put it out into the world and see what happens. And so, but that's more of a process thing, but we're trying to institute it in the museum.
Hi, I have a question. I think it's both about the medium and the content, but it's about nostalgia. Even good things like organic food and acoustic music have sort of this backlash throwback to the real, and America is so steeped in some toxic nostalgia right now. How do you avoid that allergic, toxic nostalgia factor when you're designing these experiences?
I mean, I think, well,
No. I was going to ask for a clarification.
I mean, I think that the question of a sort of toxic nostalgia, it really points to the question of authenticity, right? Like, if you can, and that's the strange thing I think about our era, is that, you know, if you think about our attention spans getting shorter, all the way down to TikTok, everything's just like flashing so fast that arguably all of these different mediums, whether it's future visions that are dystopian or exhausted, like one after the next, feel like they're cliches of themselves. And that's why I'm arguing that trying to start with that sort of human connection and beginning with that, and then sort of zooming out from there and building a machine or a project that can gather attention but then ultimately deliver that human connection is the antidote. So depending on the narrative setup, playing in like a single acoustic guitar, or that beautiful music track that you had in the demo piece I took note of. I thought it was gorgeous, right? But that's because the medium was so elegantly designed and also so futuristic that something so simple I thought really resonated in an interesting way. So that would, I guess, be the main thing is less focused on that particularity and more thinking about how to make something authentic and meaningful that people will connect with.
And I would also just say, I guess toxic nostalgia, I think toxic everything, you the challenge, or maybe the obligation as sort of creative people and sensitive people, is to understand the feeling behind the toxicity. What is it actually expressing? And it's not actually kind of similar to what I was saying about understanding the different qualities of a medium. It's like understanding what can haptics do that linear media can't, and what can linear media do. It's the same thing, like having real empathy for whatever you're engaging. And I think people who are coming with a toxic reaction to something, somewhere there is a very legitimate feeling there. It's layered in a lot of things that are, unattractive, but somewhere there is something that we have to respond to if we're actually trying to meaningfully connect with an audience.
I think that idea of empathy, for me actually, I was thinking about this particularly through both of the presentations, is that there's an aspect of experience design which has at its core a kind of empathy and a sort of desire to convey that empathy and share that empathy. It's a very, it's an ultimately very human kind of impulse, but I think it's a really fundamental aspect of this kind of quasi-disciplined grab back, whatever we're doing. I would say that the idea of values, I think, can be almost a little bit of an antidote to nostalgia, because one of the things that I appreciate very much about the Museum of the Future process is that in the values forced you constantly to be looking beyond accepted ideas and to be looking beyond sort of a cliched way to respond to a particular circumstance. And I think those values, sort of well articulated, can be a really powerful sort of like guiding force towards something new. It's something that can allow you to sort of like circumvent all of the ways that you might have dealt with those things in the past and really commit yourself actually to a new kind of experience, a new kind of world, I guess.
Yeah, I have one quick question. So how can we when we design this kind of like futuristic design, how can we keep it futuristic? Different generations, different culture, they have totally different ideas about what is a futurism. And maybe for you or for other group of people, it's different. Yeah, as you said, we will bring a lot of like a human experience here, a different sense here to make it common to accept. But maybe next generation, there's a future of the Museum of Future, not just for our generation, right? Maybe for next generation, people have different ideas, right, about the future. Like what we have, the cyberpunk, right, different post-human stories. So people have different ideas of how to keep our design futuristic. Yeah.
Basically, I think that you can't cover the future in some universal way that everyone will agree to. What I was mentioning is I think we tried to ground everything in experiences and kind of passions that unite everyone, concern for love of family, desire to learn, desire to feel part of something meaningful. All these things are kind of transcend time and transcend certainly technology and everything like that. So we tried to make sure that everything kind of speaks to that. And then whatever the trend or the technology or the policy or whatever that seems to be kind of inspiring this particular future is sort of secondary in a lot of ways to the fundamentals of it. And ideally, that would allow you to kind of create an approach to the future that you could easily change, even change entirely the assumptions of the future, but still kind of grounded in something that people recognize. Because that's my main concern, is that someone from anywhere in the world would go to the Museum of the Future and have no idea what the hell is going on, really not get the fundamental premise of it. If that's happening, then we're really failing. If they've never heard of synthetic biology, or they've never heard of, they're not concerned about the future of wellness or whatever, that's fine, but they should kind of understand why this thing exists and what it's speaking to. And that's kind of the most I think you can achieve.
I think I love that. And just to build on that, I think that there's sort of two ways to even think about the question. One is the sort of stories that you're telling in content, and then the other is the aesthetics as a design challenge. In terms of the storytelling and content, there's lots of stories of the future that feel really canned and off-putting, and others that feel more timeless. And the ones that are timeless are the ones that are, again, grounded in these sort of human truths. So people are reading 1984, which was written back in the 30s today because it's really relevant, particularly what's happening in this country. That's a sort of content story-based approach. On the aesthetic approach, it is also really interesting and just an overarching question on how you make anything timeless from a design standpoint, right? How do you make, and disciplines themselves have different rev cycles around change and evolution, right? Architecture changes much, much more slowly, maybe not in the halls of the GSD, but out in the world, because it just takes a long time to make it, right? It just physically constructing it takes an enormous amount of capital and energy versus, say, down to graphic design, magazines, much less fashion, which oftentimes is frankly designed to change as quickly as possible. And so when you think about designing a timeless future, a lot of the design principles that you would, I think, orchestrate to make a timeless piece of architecture are also relevant in terms of that future itself. So if you think about building something that's iconic or simple enough, but also surprising enough that can garner some developed attention, and then also the complexity of the world itself, right? Like if you think about Star Wars, lots of the actual, like literally if you think about episode 4, the first Star Wars movie that came out, it still looks amazing. Same thing with 2001, Stanley Kubrick. It's a brilliant, just on a technical level, it feels timeless. And both are sort of future visions. But that's because the worlds are so wholly and beautifully and elegantly put together that when you inhabit it visually, it does feel timeless. There are other ones that, much like a piece of graphic design, which is much more disposable, much less fashion, feel like their relevance has sort of come and gone. So I think it's an interesting point, but just from a design standpoint, thinking about the types of tools that you would utilize to make a building feel relevant in a decade or in a century, you might apply to your future reference and your future world that you're building as well.
I would say that this idea of sort of like conceiving something holistically and as fully as possible is as sort of like a way to kind of like maybe create enduring futures is really interesting. I mean, one of the other sort of like the side path that I went on in researching this panel was around the history of collections. And there was this very early museum in London called the Holofusakan, sometimes called the Laverian Museum. It was a competitor actually to the British Museum. Some people thought it was superior in some ways. But that word Holofusakan was it was a Greek portmanteau of something that made whole nature. So it basically created an entire world of nature. And I just love that idea of thinking about the project of constructing futures as not just sort of like some bits and bobs or partial elements, but conceiving it holistically and totally. And that those are the kinds of futures that, you know, they're still of their time, but somehow have something particular and integral and kind of ambitious to say. I think that's there's something satisfying about those holistically conceived futures. Yeah.
Thank you. So you mentioned a little bit about experiential design, sort of like being a cliche on itself. And when you think about like high modernist art in the 60s and 70s being met with like hyper minimalism, like in the late 70s and the 80s, I wonder if you see a time where at some point the most attention grabbing thing is like white walls in a gallery and good lighting. Do you ever see that being a point, or are we like past the point of no return? Will people just have to keep innovating and innovating for shorter and shorter attention spans?
Well, I mean, first of all, that experiment has been run. Robert Irwin made that piece, and it's like amazing. It's great. And it was in that moment a sort of antidote, as you said, to other works that were happening. What's interesting is that with things like TikTok and Instagram, et cetera, all of that context, all of that sort of linear progression within art or architecture or design is all collapsed, right? I had this crazy conversation with my daughter. If you'll indulge a quick family anecdote. She was 13 at the time. She's looking at her computer and has all this sort of like imagery of like people in like British gardens and things like that. And she turns to me, she's like, you know what I really like, Dad? I like old money. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? You like old money? She's like, yeah. That's what I'm into. And I'm like, tell me more. What does this mean?
Aren't we all?
I know, exactly. I'm like, tell me more. What does this mean? She's like, well, you know, the golds and the navy blues and the palettes. And I was like, is this like a channel? And she's like, oh yeah, in Pinterest, there's a whole like group of just called old money. And there's just images that are affording. She's like, I just love the aesthetics of it. And I like the how sort of feel like, but that is like how young people think about these things. Everything is just a channel that's been organized, typically algorithmically, into pattern recognition, right? So once all of that context of all of civilization has been collapsed into just another pull-down menu, which eventually will just be an AI response to what you're typing into it, then the question is, again, what are we left with that can gather people's attention, right? And I've been saying for literally most of my career, there's not a bigger screen. Like we have Times Square. You can't get a bigger screen than that. We have phones in front of our faces. We already spend, every American on average spends the vast, not just majority, but the vast majority of their time looking at their screen. Our realities are completely mediated at this point, right? When you look at your iPhone, you're like, wow, I was looking at my screen for 18 hours. That's weird, because like that's my entire day, right? So the question is, what will you do to actually both gather people's attention and then deliver on that with some type of a human connection? Because I think ultimately that is the piece that will create memories, that will create, for lack of a better word, sort of meaning for people. I think that the phone is a sort of dopamine machine, and that's a separate issue. But for us who construct things in physical space or have the opportunity to make narratives or things that at least aspire to larger meaning, it could be under the right context, a big empty white room, but it's the context and it's the story, it's the setup, it's the what will get people into the room and then what will you do with them once they're there that will ultimately make that something where people send a picture, their friends are like, oh my gosh, it's an empty white room, it's insane, it's amazing.
I'll just add one quick thing. I think within the context of perpetual media, perpetual noise, and there's like a concept that James Joyce was very like keen on called aesthetic arrest. And I think that's sort of what we, regardless of what happens, what we're trying to sort of do is create a moment with within whatever context we're in, where people wake up and they pay attention to something. So that might mean you need a big screen and you need a lot of noise. That might be actually what's necessary. Or you need utter absence of both those things. But I think that's the kind of goal, is understanding that we live in a highly mediated environment. That's not changing without, civilizational collapse or whatever. So if we assume that, and we assume that the way people consume information changes, pretty frequently, pretty rapidly, then, if we're operating within this space, it's like, okay, accept that as the reality on the ground, and then how do you intervene in a way that's meaningful, that actually gets them to, sit up straight and wake up. And then when you do, what are you delivering them so that it's worth it for them and that actually feels like a meaningful experience and not a manipulation? Because you can do it and have it be empty. So I think maybe that's what the white empty room can do, but it depends on the context that the white empty room is existing in.
Speaking of aesthetic arrest, I'm afraid we've probably come to the point in the night where I need to arrest the conversation. Hey. And we're soon going to have a white empty room here. But this has really been fabulous. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time, and certainly my attention has been held. And also, we've somehow come full circle to this very human need to communicate through an empathic means, through experience design, some possibilities for our future. So, Brendan, Jake, thank you so much. This has been fabulous. Yeah, thanks.